The meeting happened on a Tuesday morning in late September. I remember because the maple trees outside were just starting to turn, and I was thinking how beautiful they looked when Garrett Vance leaned across that cheap plastic table and said the words that would shatter everything I'd built. "Piper, I need you to adjust those numbers on the Brookfield site report." I looked up from my laptop where I'd been reviewing the soil samples for the third time, hoping somehow the lead levels would magically decrease. They hadn't. If anything, the retesting had confirmed what I already knew. That piece of land was a toxic nightmare waiting to happen. "Adjust them how?" I asked, though my gut already knew where this was heading. Garrett glanced around the temporary trailer we were using as a field office, making sure we were alone. His fingers drummed against the table, a nervous habit I'd noticed during our 6 months working together on environmental assessments for his development company. "The city council meets Thursday to approve the elementary school construction. We need those contamination levels to fall within acceptable ranges." I stared at him. "Garrett, the soil contains lead concentrations 3 times higher than safety standards. There's cadmium, arsenic. This used to be an industrial battery plant." "You know this." "I know what the report currently says," he replied, his tone shifting to something harder. "But I also know we have investors who've already committed $47 million to this project. The city has already approved the architectural plans. Construction crews are scheduled to break ground next month." My chest felt tight. "You're asking me to falsify environmental data." "I'm asking you to find a way to make this work. You're the expert. Maybe the samples were contaminated during collection. Maybe the lab made errors. Maybe we need to test different areas of the property." I tested 12 different locations across the entire site. I used 3 separate labs. The results are consistent. I could hear my voice getting higher, but I couldn't stop myself. "This isn't a gray area, Garrett. This is black and white. Children will be playing on this ground. They'll be breathing this air every day." He leaned back in his chair, studying me with those pale blue eyes that had seemed so trustworthy when I first took this contract. "Piper, you're 31 years old. You've been building your consulting practice for what, 4 years now? You've got a good reputation in this industry. Don't throw it away over numbers that can be interpreted different ways." Interpreted different ways? I felt something cold spreading through my chest. Lead poisoning doesn't care about interpretation. Garrett stood up and walked to the small window overlooking the Brookfield site. 200 acres of what would soon become Willowbrook Elementary School if I signed off on his lies. "Let me be very clear about something," he said without turning around. "I've been developing properties in this state for 15 years. I know every environmental consultant, every regulatory official, every engineering firm worth working with. If you can't be flexible on this project, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly how difficult you are to work with." The threat hung between us like smoke from a fire neither of us wanted to acknowledge. "You're threatening to blacklist me." "I'm explaining reality." He turned back to face me. "This industry runs on relationships, trust, cooperation. Companies need consultants who understand that perfection is the enemy of progress. If you develop a reputation as someone who creates problems instead of solving them, who prioritizes theoretical risks over real-world economics, you'll find yourself with a lot of free time to contemplate your principles." I thought about my student loans, my mortgage, the 3 other projects I had lined up that could disappear with a few phone calls from Garrett to the right people. But then I thought about something else. My name is Piper Delacroix, and before I dive deeper into what happened next, could you please take a few seconds to tell me in the comments where you're listening from? Because I want to know where my story is reaching. I need to know there are people out there who understand why I made the choice I'm about to tell you about. And please like, subscribe, and hit the bell, because this story gets so much more complicated than what you think. See, what Garrett didn't know about me, what nobody in my professional life knew, was that for the past 3 years, I'd been anonymously funding a merit scholarship at Central State University. $5,000 every semester for a student studying environmental science. The recipient was someone I'd never met, someone whose essays about environmental justice and corporate responsibility had moved me to tears when I read them, as part of the scholarship committee's blind review process. That student was Madison Vance, Garrett's daughter. I discovered this completely by accident 8 months earlier when I attended a university fundraising dinner. Madison was there presenting her research on soil contamination in low-income neighborhoods, and when she mentioned her last name during the Q&A, something clicked. Later that evening, I did some discreet research and confirmed what I suspected. This passionate, brilliant young woman who wrote about holding corporations accountable for environmental damage was the daughter of the man who'd become my biggest client. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. Here was this kid who worshipped her father, who talked constantly in her scholarship essays about how he'd inspired her to pursue environmental science, how he'd taught her that development should improve communities rather than harm them. She had no idea that her anonymous benefactor was sitting in trailer meetings with Daddy, watching him pressure consultants to cut corners that could poison children. But in that moment, facing Garrett's threat, I made a decision that would change everything. "I won't falsify the report," I said quietly. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. "Then we have a problem." "No, Garrett, you have a problem. I'm writing my report exactly as the science dictates. The Brookfield site is unsuitable for an elementary school without extensive remediation that would cost millions of dollars and delay construction for at least 2 years. Then you're finished in this industry." I packed up my laptop and stood to leave, but at the trailer entrance, I turned back. "One more thing. That scholarship I've been funding at Central State, the one your daughter Madison receives, I think it's time she learned who her anonymous benefactor really is." For the first time in our conversation, Garrett looked genuinely confused. "What scholarship?" I smiled and stepped out into that beautiful September morning, breathing air that didn't smell like lies and compromise. What happened next was even more brutal than Garrett had promised. Within 2 weeks, my contracts with 3 other development companies were canceled. Suddenly, firms I'd worked with for years stopped returning my calls. When I applied for new projects, I was told positions had been filled, even though I could see the same job postings running weeks later. By November, I was working part-time at a coffee shop just to pay my bills, spending my evenings researching bankruptcy lawyers and wondering if I'd made the stupidest decision of my life. That's when I decided it was time to meet Madison. I found her studying in the university library on a Thursday afternoon, buried in textbooks about environmental policy. She was smaller than I'd expected from her conference presentation, with dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and her father's pale blue eyes. She wore a faded t-shirt from an environmental advocacy group and had covered her laptop with stickers promoting renewable energy initiatives. "Madison Vance?" I approached her table carefully. She looked up, confused. "Yes? My name is Piper Delacroix. I'm an environmental consultant, and I have something important to tell you about your scholarship." Her face lit up with curiosity rather than suspicion. "Are you with the scholarship committee? I've been hoping to thank whoever's been supporting my education. It's completely changed my life." I sat down across from her, my heart racing. "Actually, I'm the person who's been funding your scholarship. I've been doing it anonymously for 3 years. Madison's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, gratitude, confusion. "You? But why? I mean, thank you, but I don't understand." "Because your essays about environmental justice were some of the most passionate, intelligent writing I'd ever read. Because you understand that our work isn't just about science, it's about protecting people who don't have the power to protect themselves." She was quiet for a moment, processing this revelation. "This is incredible. I can't believe I'm finally meeting you. Your support has meant everything to me and my family. My father talks about it all the time. How proud he is that someone recognized my potential." This was the moment I'd been planning for months. "Madison, I need to tell you something else. Something about your father." Her smile faltered slightly. "What about him?" I pulled out a folder containing copies of my original Brookfield report, the real one, with the actual contamination data. "Your father hired me to assess a development site where he's planning to build an elementary school. The soil contains dangerous levels of lead, cadmium, and arsenic. When I refused to falsify my report to hide the contamination, he had me blacklisted from the industry. Madison's face went pale as she looked through the documents. This can't be right. My father would never ask someone to cover up environmental hazards. He's the one who taught me that development should improve communities. I thought you should know, I said gently. Not because I want to hurt your relationship with him, but because you deserve to understand what's being done in the name of progress. She stared at the soil analysis data, her hands trembling slightly. These numbers. If this is accurate, children could develop learning disabilities, behavioral problems. That's why I couldn't lie about it. That's why I'm telling you now. Madison closed the folder and looked at me with those eyes that were so much like her father's, but filled with a pain he'd never shown. What do you want me to do with this information? Nothing, I said, standing to leave. This isn't about what I want. It's about what you can live with, knowing. That conversation happened on a Thursday. By the following Tuesday, everything began to unravel for Garrett Vance in ways I never could have predicted. Madison didn't confront her father immediately. Instead, she did something much more devastating. She started asking questions. Over dinner that weekend, she casually mentioned a news article about lead contamination at a school in Ohio. Dad, something like that could never happen with one of your projects, right? You always make sure environmental testing is thorough? Garrett, completely unaware of our conversation, launched into his usual speech about responsible development and rigorous safety standards. Madison listened and nodded, taking mental notes of every claim he made. Then she started researching his other projects. Madison was a senior environmental science student with access to university databases, public records, and professors who specialized in environmental law. She began pulling permits, inspection reports, and compliance documents for every development Garrett had completed in the past 5 years. What she found destroyed her faith in everything she thought she knew about her family. 3 projects with environmental corners cut, 2 instances of permits obtained through questionable means. 1 case where a wetland had been filled without proper authorization, resulting in flooding that damaged a dozen homes downstream. But Madison didn't explode. She didn't create drama or demand explanations. Instead, she grew quiet, distant, intellectually superior in a way that slowly drove Garrett insane. During family dinners, she started making observations about corporate environmental responsibility. She'd mention news stories about companies that prioritized profits over public health, speaking with the kind of quiet moral certainty that made everyone at the table squirm. It's interesting how some developers will compromise anything to meet a deadline, she'd say while passing the salad. Like they think making money justifies poisoning communities. Garrett initially dismissed these comments as typical college idealism. You'll understand when you're working in the real world, he'd tell her. Everything's more complicated than it seems in textbooks. But Madison would just smile, that patient smile of someone who knows exactly how complicated things really are. She changed her major to environmental law the following semester. When Garrett asked why, she said she'd decided corporate accountability was more important than pure science. Someone needs to hold companies responsible when they put profits before people, she explained over coffee during winter break. Garrett laughed nervously. That's a pretty hostile way to look at business, sweetheart. Most companies are trying to do the right thing. Madison just sipped her coffee and didn't respond. The distance between them grew wider every month. Madison stopped asking her father for career advice. She stopped sharing details about her studies. When he tried to discuss his projects, she'd change the subject or find reasons to leave the room. What made it truly brutal was that Garrett had no idea why his daughter was pulling away. From his perspective, their relationship was deteriorating for no apparent reason. He'd raised her to care about environmental issues, so why was she suddenly treating him like the enemy? He started overcompensating desperately. He began making increasingly dramatic gestures at work, funding unnecessary environmental studies, hiring additional consultants for projects that didn't require them, even turning down a profitable development contract because it involved wetland modification. But nothing worked. Madison remained polite but emotionally unreachable. The Brookfield project eventually collapsed when the city council discovered the contamination through their own independent testing. Garrett's company took massive financial losses, and his reputation in the development community suffered permanent damage. But the professional consequences were nothing compared to the personal devastation of losing his daughter's respect. Years passed. Madison graduated law school and took a position with the State Environmental Protection Agency, prosecuting companies that violated environmental regulations. She became excellent at her job, ruthlessly thorough, impossible to intimidate, completely incorruptible. Garrett retired early, spending his final decade in the industry trying desperately to rebuild his reputation through environmental advocacy work. He funded scholarship programs, supported conservation initiatives, and spoke at conferences about sustainable development practices. None of it mattered to Madison. She attended family events but remained coolly professional, discussing weather and current events with the distant politeness usually reserved for acquaintances. What Garrett never understood was that I hadn't destroyed his career. I'd done something much more precise and permanent. I'd destroyed the unconditional love and admiration from the one person whose opinion mattered most to him. The beautiful irony was that Madison became exactly the kind of environmental advocate she'd always dreamed of being. The scholarship money I'd invested in her education had created a powerful force for justice in the world, just not in the way her father had intended. Every case she prosecuted, every company she held accountable, every corrupt practice she exposed was funded by the same moral clarity that had made me choose honesty over financial security in that trailer 3 years earlier. But this story isn't over yet, because what happened at the trial 6 months ago changed everything again in ways that still give me chills when I think about it. 6 months ago, I got a call that I never expected to receive. It was from an attorney with the State Environmental Protection Agency. Ms. Delacroix, we're prosecuting a case involving systematic environmental fraud across multiple development projects. Your name has come up as someone who may have relevant testimony. My stomach lurched. What kind of case? Environmental data, falsification, permit fraud, and conspiracy to endanger public health. The lead prosecutor specifically requested that we contact you. 3 weeks later, I found myself sitting in a courthouse waiting room, wearing the only professional suit I still owned, watching lawyers shuffle papers and wondering how my life had led me back to this moment. The case was bigger than I'd imagined. Garrett's company wasn't the only one involved. The prosecution had uncovered an entire network of developers, consultants, and regulatory officials who'd been collaborating to circumvent environmental protections for over a decade. Millions of dollars in profits, dozens of compromised sites, thousands of families exposed to contamination. But what I didn't know until I walked into that courtroom was who the lead prosecutor would be. Madison Vance stood at the prosecution table in a navy suit, her dark hair pulled back in the same style she'd worn in the university library all those years ago. She was 31 now, the same age I'd been when her father tried to destroy my career. But there was something steel-hard in her posture that hadn't been there before. A quiet authority that commanded respect from everyone in the room. She glanced up as I entered, and for just a moment, our eyes met. Her expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker across her face, recognition, maybe even gratitude. I took a seat in the gallery and watched her work. Madison was devastating, methodical. She presented evidence with surgical precision, dismantling the defense's arguments piece by piece. She'd spent 3 years building this case, tracking financial records, interviewing witnesses, analyzing environmental data that had been falsified across multiple sites. What became clear as the trial progressed was that Garrett's pressure on me hadn't been an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic pattern of environmental fraud that had been going on for years, involving dozens of consultants who'd been willing to adjust their findings for the right price. But I'd been the only one who'd refused. And because I'd refused, because I'd been blacklisted, because I'd lost everything and had nothing left to lose, I'd kept every document, every email, every piece of evidence from my work with Garrett's company, stored carefully in files that I'd never expected to use. When Madison called her witnesses, she started with the consultants who'd cooperated with the fraud. One by one, they testified about the pressure they'd received, the threats, the promises of future work if they played along. Their testimony painted a picture of an industry where environmental protection had become just another line item to be negotiated. Then came the corporate executives, trying to minimize their involvement, claiming they'd trusted their consultants and had no knowledge of any wrongdoing. Finally, Garrett himself took the stand. He looked older than his 63 years, wearing an expensive gray suit that couldn't hide how much weight he'd lost. His confidence from that trailer meeting was completely gone, replaced by the defensive posture of someone who knew he was trapped. Madison questioned him with professional detachment, walking him through project after project where environmental corners had been cut. Her voice never wavered, never revealed any personal connection to the defendant. Mr. Vance, regarding the Brookfield Elementary School site, you hired environmental consultant Piper Delacroix to assess soil contamination, correct? Yes. And when Ms. Delacroix's initial report showed lead concentrations 3 times above safety standards, what did you tell her? Garrett's lawyer objected, but the judge allowed the question. I asked her to double-check her findings. Double-check or change them? I wanted to make sure they were accurate. Madison pulled out a folder. Mr. Vance, I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 47. This is an email from your assistant to 3 other environmental consulting firms, sent 2 days after Ms. Delacroix submitted her report. Would you read the subject line aloud? Garrett's face went pale. Urgent. Need environmental consultant willing to work with challenging timelines. And in the body of that email, what instructions did your assistant give regarding the Brookfield site assessment? I don't recall the specific wording. Allow me to refresh your memory. Quote, previous consultant was inflexible regarding acceptable contamination parameters. Need someone who understands real-world development constraints. End quote. What did you mean by inflexible regarding acceptable contamination parameters? The courtroom was completely silent. Even Garrett's lawyer looked like he wanted to disappear. I meant that Ms. Delacroix wasn't considering the broader context of the project. The broader context being your financial investment? Objection. Sustained. But the damage was done. Madison had methodically demonstrated that Garrett hadn't just asked me to adjust numbers, he'd immediately sought other consultants who would be more flexible about poisoning children. After 3 days of testimony, the judge called for a brief recess before closing arguments. That's when something happened that I still can't quite believe. Madison approached me in the hallway outside the courtroom. Ms. Delacroix, could I speak with you privately for a moment? We found an empty conference room, and for the first time in 6 years, we were alone together. I never properly thanked you, she said quietly. For what? For refusing to lie, for telling me the truth about what my father really was, for losing everything rather than compromise your principles. I looked at this brilliant woman who'd become everything I'd hoped she would when I first read her scholarship essays. You didn't need me to become who you are, Madison. That was always inside you. She was quiet for a moment. Do you know what the hardest part was? Not losing respect for him. It was realizing that everything I'd admired about him was a lie I'd told myself. I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt your relationship with your father. You didn't hurt it, she said firmly. You revealed what it really was. There's a difference. That afternoon, Madison delivered her closing argument with the kind of moral authority that comes from someone who's faced the worst kind of betrayal and emerged stronger. Environmental fraud isn't a victimless crime, she told the jury. When developers falsify contamination data, when consultants adjust numbers to meet financial deadlines, when regulatory officials look the other way, they're stealing something precious from communities, the right to make informed decisions about their children's health and safety. She gestured toward the evidence table, stacked high with falsified reports and fraudulent permits. The defendants want you to believe this was just business, just the normal give and take of development projects. But what they're really asking you to accept is that profits matter more than playgrounds, that meeting construction deadlines is more important than preventing learning disabilities in 6-year-olds. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts. But the moment I'll never forget happened just before the judge dismissed the court. Your Honor, Madison said, standing at the prosecution table. Before we conclude, the state would like to recognize someone whose integrity made this prosecution possible. The judge looked curious. Proceed, counselor. 6 years ago, environmental consultant Piper Delacroix was asked to falsify contamination data that would have exposed hundreds of children to lead poisoning. She refused, even though she knew it would destroy her career. Her decision to prioritize public health over personal financial security preserved the evidence that made this case possible. Madison turned to look directly at me. "Ms. Delacroix, would you please stand?" I felt like I was in a dream as I rose from my seat in the gallery. Every person in that courtroom was looking at me. Jurors, lawyers, reporters, family members of the defendants. "Your Honor, I would like the record to reflect that justice was served today, not just through the legal system, but through the courage of someone who chose to do the right thing when it cost her everything." The judge nodded solemnly. "The record will so reflect. Ms. Delacroix, this court recognizes your commitment to professional integrity under extremely difficult circumstances." As I sat back down, I noticed Garrett staring at me from the defendant's table. For the first time since that trailer meeting 6 years ago, he looked like he truly understood what he'd lost when he tried to force me to compromise my principles. After the sentencing hearing 2 months later, I ran into Madison one more time outside the courthouse. Garrett had received 3 years in federal prison, along with substantial fines that would wipe out most of his remaining assets. "How are you doing?" I asked her. "Better than I expected," she said. "It's strange, but prosecuting this case felt like honoring everything I thought my father had taught me about environmental responsibility, even though he was the one I was prosecuting." I understood what she meant. In a twisted way, Garrett had raised her to become exactly the kind of person who would hold him accountable for his crimes. "What's next for you?" she asked. I smiled, thinking about the consulting contracts that had started coming in after the trial publicity. Companies wanting to hire the environmental consultant who'd been willing to get blacklisted rather than falsify safety data. "I think I'm going to be okay." "Good," Madison said. "The world needs more people who choose integrity over convenience." As I watched her walk away, I thought about the scholarship money I'd invested in her education all those years ago. It had been the best investment I'd ever made, not just financially, but morally. That money had helped create a prosecutor who'd just sent dozens of environmental criminals to prison and protected thousands of families from contamination. But the real revenge wasn't sending Garrett to prison. It wasn't even destroying his relationship with his daughter. The real revenge was that Madison had become living proof that environmental protection and corporate accountability were more important than family loyalty. Every case she prosecuted, every company she held responsible, every corrupt practice she exposed was a monument to the principles her father had tried to make me abandon. She'd become the person he'd pretended to be, while he'd revealed himself to be everything she'd been trained to prosecute. And somewhere in a federal minimum security facility, Garrett Vance was spending his days thinking about the choices that had cost him everything that mattered: his freedom, his reputation, his company, and most devastatingly, the love and respect of the daughter who'd once believed he was a hero. The beautiful irony was that in trying to destroy my career for refusing to poison children, he'd created the exact conditions that would lead to his own destruction by the child he loved most. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about what you do to someone. Sometimes it's about who you help them become. If you've made it this far in my story, I need you to do something for me. I need you to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and hit that notification bell. Not because I need the algorithm boost, but because stories like this need to be shared. Because there are people out there right now facing the same choice I faced in that trailer 6 years ago, the choice between doing what's right and doing what's profitable. They need to know that sometimes, when you refuse to compromise your principles, the universe finds a way to turn your integrity into the exact weapon needed to defeat the people who tried to destroy you for having it. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them most.